Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining. This is day 4 of Oracle integration session. And in this session, we are going to create our first app-driven integration. So in previous session, we already done with creating the scheduled integrations and where we added few parameters to the scheduled integrations. So now this in this session, we will have to create app-driven integration. But before going to cover that creating app-driven integration, I just have to cover few points so that it will help us when we will go for creating the app-driven integration. So for that, first we will cover that adapters, which we already discussed, but just for brief here, we will discuss on that part. And then we will go for connection that adapters we are going to use while creating the connections. And there is one point is like connection roles. So what is connection roles and why we are using that connections roles while creating the connections for a specific adapters that we are going to discuss, and then we'll create our connections and then we'll create our integrations. So we'll check that why we require connection while creating integrations for when we are going to create app-driven integration. We'll see one by one. So as we already discussed earlier, that adapter is something that which is going to define that which third-party system we are going to connect. So as OIC is a middleware application, so in case of OIC, whatever application it can be Oracle Fusion application, or it can be Oracle EBS, or it can be Oracle database or ATP database, anything, every system is a third-party system in front of OIC. So when we are going to create integration, so in that integration, there can be two situations that the one situation can be that we have to invoke the third party system, and another situation can be that third party system is going to trigger our integration. So when we are saying that trigger our integration, it means that our integration will having that flexibility that can be provided to the system so that they can invoke our integration. So most of the time in our integrations, so just like in schedule integration, when we are creating schedule integration, we have one endpoint that's called schedule, right? The starting endpoint and the very first endpoint. That schedule endpoints help that schedule integrations to initiate or to start the execution. So when we'll go for app-driven integration, I will show you that in app-driven integration, we are not going to get any endpoint in that canvas. So that's the reason we require minimum one connection to app-driven integration. So that's also we will cover in this session only, so that we'll get to know that the use of that connection over there. So now it's time for connection. So obviously, for each and every adapters we are not going to directly use in OIC. Adapter is something that they are just going to tell us that which third party system we are going to connect, but how we will connect to the third party system, that will be defined in connection. So while creating the connections, we have to use the adapter so that that connection can identify which third party system we are going to connect, and what is the connectivity details, like the we have to provide the user password only to connect with that, or do we have any VPN or any agents required for that connection, or any firewall or any whitelisting and all it's required to connect with the third party system. So everything is going to define in that connection only. So connection helps integration to connect with to connect with that external system or any third party system. And in connection, we are using adapters that is going to define that connection is going to connect with which third party system. For example, we have to connect Oracle database. So that's why we will create connection, Oracle database connection. But while creating the connection, we have to select that adapters as Oracle database. Same as we have Oracle ERP Cloud Adapter, Oracle HCM Cloud Adapters, we have ATP adapters that helps to connect with that database, or that connect with that system. So that's we are going to create. So once we will go for creating the connections, while creating the connection, who majorly like it will ask you to select the roles of that connections. So type of connection is something different than the roles of connection. So when we are saying that types of connection, so whatever adapters you will select, that type will be for that connection. For example, I selected adapter as a ATP adapter. So our type of that connection will be ATP type connection. But while creating the connection, it will ask you three options for the roles. You can see the one is trigger, another one is invoke, and the last one is trigger and invoke. So there is differences between trigger and invoke. So in any integration, there will be only one trigger connection. So when we are saying that trigger connection, so that trigger connection is going to help to initiate the integration, or that trigger connection will help integration to execute. So for example, we created our integration, and that integration we want to execute on a specific time. So we need something in our integration so that that integration can be started. That's why in schedule integration, we have schedule endpoint, and that schedule endpoint, obviously we are going to use scheduler over there. In case of app-driven integration, or in generation 3, we are saying that application integration. So that application integration, here you can see in that screenshot also, right? So once we will go to create app integrations, we will be able to see. So this is the screenshot when I created app-driven integration, and that app-driven integration doesn't have any endpoint in this canvas. So like how integration will start at this point. That's why we require trigger connection. Trigger connection is something that is going to help integration to start. So in our case, we are going to use REST connection as a trigger role connection, so that when our integration will be completed, that our integration will be considered as a REST endpoint. So one of the reason when we are using app-driven integration to expose our OIC as a REST services. So most of the time, like if you heard about that, we have one VBCS page or any third-party system having their web pages and all. And from the web pages, they want to execute our OIC. Then how it will be possible to execute our OIC from their system? So using that app-driven integration, it's possible. So while creating, we will create app-driven integration, and while creating app-driven integration, we will select REST endpoint as a REST connection as a trigger endpoint, so that our integration will be exposed as a REST API. And always, like app-driven integration provide flexibilities to add the request payload in integration, add the response payload in our integrations. So when we are saying that request payload of that integration, it is something that when we will run the integration, so what value we are going to pass, that value is known as request payload. And when that integration will be executed, and what value we are going to expect from that integration. So that unstructured values, like just like it can be XMLs or JSON. So most of the time we are going to use JSON format only, because that JSON is too much easy than XML to identify, to just create the payloads and all. And in our example also, we will use JSON only. So when we are creating integration in a such a way that while running the integration, we have to pass some values. That values is known as request payload. And when integration will be executed, and in once that integration will be completed, we are going to expect some values in return. That values is known as response payload. So it is same like APIs. So any of the API, REST API, SOAP API, or SOAP web services you executed or you worked on earlier. So while executing that API, you are going to pass some values, right? And in response, they are returning some values. So that kind of things we can configure in our OIC. And that's why we required at least one trigger connection. So I will show you that one also. So in our OIC or in our integrations, when we added trigger connections, so as I told you one point, that in our integration, there will be only one trigger connection. We cannot have more than one trigger connection in OIC. This is the point related to trigger connection. If you will move to the next, the second role type is invoke. So when we are saying that invoke connection, so all these adapters we will use while creating the connections. So when we want to invoke third-party system or any legacy system or external system from OIC. For example, here you in the screenshot only you can see this is our integration we created. From integration only, we want to invoke the ATP database to insert few data. So from OIC only, we are going to invoke ATP services, right? So that's why OIC provide ATP adapters. So we created connection by using ATP adapters, and that connection we are going to use in our integration. So in this type, like in the case when we use this connection, that connection is considered as an invoke connection. So if suppose we will create trigger connection and we want to use the trigger connection here, so it will not be possible to use the trigger connection here, because in our integration there will be only one trigger connection, and that trigger connection will be used in very first of that integration, or that the first as a first endpoint only. So that using that trigger connection, we can initiate our integration, or we can start our integration. In our integration, we can have multiple invoke connections. So invoke connection is simply that when from OIC, when we have to call any external system using REST services or using web services or by using that connections available or adapters available in the system. So that kind of things, it will be considered as an invoke. So the calling that ATP endpoint is a one example. Another can be that from OIC, we are going to call the BIP report of Fusion, right? And we want to call the BIP report data into OIC. So that's why we have SOAP web services so that it will return the BIP data. So that SOAP web services, when you want to execute from OIC, that will be considered as an invoke, that we are going to invoke that SOAP web services from OIC. At the time, we will create SOAP connection as a invoke role type connection. And yes, in last, we have the third role type, that is trigger and invoke. So just like trigger, the trigger connection we can use only in starting of the integration. Invoke connection we can use only in between the integration, not from a starting in, and it can be in last of that integration, it can be in mid of integration, anywhere. So for example, you want to create a connection, that connection can be used as a trigger also, or that connection also you can use to invoke any APIs. So at that time, you will create that connection as a trigger and invoke role type, so that that specific connection can be used as a trigger to that integration, or that can be used to invoke that connects invoke that services. So that all we are going to use. One example, yeah, one example for trigger and invoke will be, one example for trigger and invoke will be that we have REST API to create AP invoices. So we are going to create one REST connection. That REST connection, we provided that URL for Oracle Fusion, where we want to create the AP invoices. And we want that a specific single connection only to trigger our integration and to invoke that AP invoice REST API. So at the time, we will create that connection as a trigger and invoke, so that that connection we can use as a trigger to that integration. And also we will use that, we can use that connections to invoke the REST API of Oracle Fusion. So at the time, we will use this kind of roles. So in OIC, we have total 3 roles for connection. That role is trigger, invoke, and trigger and invoke. So the basic differences between trigger and invoke is in in a single integration, there can be only one trigger connection used, but in a single integration, there can be multiple invoke role type connection we can use. That can be that in our integration, we can use SOAP invoke connection, we can use REST invoke connection, we can use ATP connections to insert data into database table. We can use ATP, we can use FTP invoke connections to insert file or place file over file server to get the file from file server. That kind of things we are going to work. So it's all about connections role. So once we, Mhm. Yes, that's why I told you, right? So that's why I've given one example that we have one REST API. That REST API is going to create AP invoices in Oracle Fusion application, and our point is to create integration. That we want to create one integration. That integration will take some values while running that integration, and based on that value, it will create AP invoices in system. So as I told you that for invoking that REST API to create invoices in Fusion, we require a REST connection. So that connection we are going to use in OIC as an invoke. That's fine, right? Same connection we can expose or we can use to initiate our integration, to start our integration, to use as a trigger of that connection. So in this time, there is no need to create two separate connections. So we will create only one single connection, and that role we will provide to the connection as trigger and invoke, this trigger and invoke, so that that specific connection can be used to initiate our integration just by adding as a trigger endpoint, or can be used as a invoking the REST API as a invoke endpoint or in between anywhere. So that's we are going to work on. So the same example here you can see, I just taken one example to create a REST connection. So in this REST connection, we given this Fusion URL. This is the Fusion application URL, and here we provided the user ID and password for that. So the same connection we can use in our OIC to invoke the REST API of Oracle Fusion, just providing the resource URL here in that integration only. and the same connection we can use to initiate our integration. So that kind of things we can work in OIC. So now let's move to that OIC instance where I will show you that how we can create connection. So and obviously before going to create connection, so if you will see, let me open this instance twice so that I can just show you the comparison between REST and SOAP. So here you can see I'm going to create the REST, create that schedule integration. So I'm just going to click access 01. I will delete it later. So this is schedule I selected. So once I'm selecting any schedule kind of integration, so that schedule integration is by default providing us endpoint. That endpoint is named as schedule endpoint. This is trigger endpoint, right? So this is the trigger endpoint. Using this endpoint, this schedule integration is going to execute, going to start. The same way, if we will go and we'll try to create app-driven integration here, that is application type integration, XX0C or 02. So once we will try to create, so this in this type, we are not able to see any endpoint here. So that's the basic differences in schedule integration and the app-driven integration. And now that how our app-driven integration will execute, right? So without any endpoint, that OIC integration will not be executed. That's why we have to add at least one trigger connection in app-driven integration. So if you will see another difference is this is our schedule integration, and in the schedule integration, if you want to add another connection, what we can do? We can just navigate to the left right hand side, and this is the point where we will click and we will be able to see all the connections available here. So as this is our schedule integration and it's having already one trigger connection, trigger endpoint added, so it will not allow you to select any of the trigger connections. So here you can see whatever connection is there, right? You are able to see the connection. All these connections are either invoke type connection, invoke role connection, or trigger and invoke connection. Any of the connection. If you want, I can just show you that one too. So the connection is ms underscore ftp con, right? So let me search this one. Let me go back to the connection. So you can see, right, this one ms ftp underscore con. This is the same connection right here. So the role for this connection, you can see that invoke connection, right? So this connection having role as invoke, you can see here. Another connection, if you will see, so for example, let me see any trigger connection. This is the trigger connection, right? XX rest underscore trigger con, right? This connection you will not be able to find here. If I will search XXX rest, right? You will not be able to find the connection here. Why? This connection role type is trigger, and in our integration we cannot have trigger integration after the endpoint is added, after the trigger endpoint added. So the same way, if this connection I will search in this app driven integration, we will be able to see that connection here. So let me leave this one, right? So if I will click here, this one, you can see that connection we will be able to find XXXR. Right here you can see XX rest trigger con we are able to see here, but the same connection we are not able to see here. Why? This the features of trigger connection, that in our integration we can have only one trigger connection, but the condition is in schedule integration we cannot have trigger connection. Why? Because that the trigger connection is something that can be used to initiate the integration or to starting of the integration only. But in this schedule integration, it's already there that schedule endpoint to start this integration. That's why this connection we are not able to see over there. So you can take any of the examples. For example, here you can see Fox ATP con. This is trigger and invoke connection. So this trigger and invoke connection can be find both places. So this trigger and invoke connection you can find here too. That FOAS. You can see, right? FOAS ATP con. So as this connection role type is trigger and invoke both. That's why we are able to find this connection here to add a trigger point, and the same connection you will be able to find here too. You can see FOS ATP connection to use as a invoke. So like we are done with the basics of trigger and invoke, or trigger or invoke and trigger and invoke. So one more thing to identify, here you can see in the schedule integration, when we created this integration, the connection type you will see right here, it's the circular icon. And if you will move your cursor here, you will be able to see that invokes message, right? Are you able to see that pop-up message and invoke? So it seems it is saying that whatever connection you will be able to see here, that connection having the role as invoke. And obvious, the third connection role, that is trigger and invoke, also contain invoke. So that's why here we are able to see all these things. So the same way, if we will move to that app-driven integration, if this integration doesn't have any endpoint, that's why it's showing the icon. And once you will move your cursor here, it will show you that trigger. It means that this integration need first trigger connection, then after it will allow you to add another that invoke connection. So that's the basic differences. So let's move to that integration and we will create one connection here. So here I already created one REST connection. Let me delete this one. So now here I have to create connection. To create the connection, we just have to go to the create. So here you can see you are also able to find the one tab that is adapter. But this is just we are using to check that adapter connection or check the details of that adapters and all. To use this adapter, obviously we have to go to the connection, and in the connection we have to create one connection, and while creating the connection, whatever adapters available in the system, it will list down all the adapters here, and you have to select any of the adapters for which you want to create the connection. So right now I want to create a connection for REST type because I want to expose our app-driven integration as a REST API. So for that, I will select here as a REST. You can see this is the REST adapter. So once I will select this REST adapter, it's asking to give the name, and obvious identifier will come automatically. So I will give the name as FOA. This is the REST connection. So I will use REST to name, and I will just use CONN. Instead of that only, you can also mention the role for that connection. So this connection we are going to create as a trigger. So I will use TRI underscore CONN. So by looking for the name only, anyone can identify this is the REST trigger type connection. So now here identifier it comes automatically, and now role here we have to select as a trigger. So I will select the trigger connection role here, and now I will click on create. So this is the page where we are going to create connection as a trigger role by selecting the connection type as REST. Another way, in the another screen, I'm just going to create one more connection. I will go back, and here I will select the connection as REST again, and I will give the name as, so instead of yes, I will use invoke INV. Right, so this is separate name. I will select the role type as invoke. I will show you the differences. That's why I'm just going to create all this single one only. So just we created here. So now we have, this is our trigger connection role. This is our invoke connection role. And now let me add one more. So I will just make a duplicate of this instance. So let me go to the design connection here. And now again, I will select one more connection. Adapter will be REST only. And here I will select the, instead of invoke, I will use tree underscore invoke. So this connection will select as a type as trigger and invoke. That is selected, right? So now I will click on create. So now you are able to see that we have three connections page open here, right? The first one is trigger. So when we are using the trigger is doesn't asking that URL and all. So it's just asking that the security. So by default, that security is coming like OAuth 2.0. So I will select the basic authentication so that just we can directly provide the ID password for this OIC instance and we can invoke our integration. I will explain this point later, right? So here you can see it's not asking. Here we connected the connection as a trigger and it's not asking the URL, right? Anywhere that which web services, which REST web services you are going to call, it's not asking, right? So why it's not asking? Because we are created this connection as a trigger, and you know that trigger connection will only be used to initiate the integration, not to invoke any REST API, right? That's why it's not asking any URL for that REST API. So now here I will move to the another page, and here in the page I selected the role as invoke. And when we are saying that invoke, it means that using this connection, we are going to invoke REST API. We are going to call any REST API for any third-party system. Obvious, when we want to invoke any REST API for any system, we need to provide the URL. We need to provide the ID password for that API or web services which we want to access using this REST connection. That's why here you can see it's asking the connection URL. So in this step, if we want to connect with that Oracle Fusion application, so here we have to provide the Oracle Fusion URL. And then here we have to provide the ID password for that URL. So as earlier I used that one, that's why it's showing that ID password here. So here we have to provide the URL. So let me check that do I have any URL or not. So let me see that this is a Fusion URL. Just for testing purpose I'm using. I'm not sure whether that ID password is same or not. So here you can see. And now for accessing this REST API, this URL for this REST API, what kind of connection they allow? They allow connection that the open API or that they having different security and all, or just that it is a REST based API. So I will select this REST based API. So whatever REST API available in the system related to Oracle transactions or any third party system, most of the time, like we know that that is going to be REST API. So you will select that connection type as a REST API based URL. So why? Because we know that this is Fusion URL. So then why we use that Fusion URL here? So for example, if we will search any of the API, so REST API to create AP invoice, for example, in Oracle Fusion. So here you can see Oracle provided that the web services to invoke the REST API. So this is the resource URL. So by concatenating this resource URL with that Fusion host or Fusion URL, it will be considered as a complete URL. So once I will copy this Fusion URL, so this will be the Oracle Fusion REST API to create AP invoice. This is the REST web services. So that's why what we are going to do, this is the host of that URL or host for that web services, this REST API. So this host we provided here in this connection. We provided this REST here in the connection or remaining part, this part, right? So when we will use this connection in our OIC, so we will provide remaining this part while adding this connection in OIC. So once we will create transaction, I will explain you that part too. So this is the URL I given, and for this URL, to access this URL, which user ID password required, that's why we use here user and password. And obvious, for selecting the user and password, we have the security type policies which we are going to use. So what kind of security they added to access their services, to access their system. So here you can select that your services. And obviously, like you are not the owner of this API or owner of the system, so you will not be aware about that which securities policies you have to select. So if you are going to invoke any third party system, just like any GST service provider URL or any external service URL, so when you will get that URL user password, you have to ask that which kind of security it is having. So if it is having basic authentication, obviously we will go. So all the Oracle Fusion web services available, that the REST API having the security as a basic authentication. So just you have to provide the user and password. So this is the point we added here. So if you will see, as this is the public gateway only, so we just don't want to do anything. So here we have private endpoint also, connectivity agent also. So this private gateway and connectivity agent will used when our Fusion application having their security added, just like VPN. So without a VPN, you cannot access your Fusion application At the time you required agent to connect here in the connection. So we will create one connection where we will use agent, so that we will also learn about the agents and all in upcoming days. So now here we are done with that, providing the URL details, providing the ID password to access this URL. This is the REST connection, and if you will see, the connection status is in draft right now, and the percentage you will able to see it's 8% or something. Just whenever you started initiated providing any values, it's moving big percentage, right? So now this is our third connection, which connection having the role type as a trigger and invoke. So now trigger and invoke will ask you all the information, connectivity information, same as the invoke. Why? Trigger is going to have less information and invoke is having more information. That's why whatever is the maximum information required for the connection. So when you will create that trigger and role connection, it will ask you that the more information which is having. So obviously in that, while creating invoke type connection, we have to provide the URL, we have to provide the user ID and password. So the same way, when you will create connection as a triggered and invoke, you have to provide the URL type, you have to provide the connection URL and ID and password for that. So let me use the same URL here to now. So this is our first connection. So for making that connection as 100%, so just you have to go and test. So as this trigger type REST connection doesn't require any URL, any ID, password, and any user for that. That's what's automatically when you created, it's moved to the configure status. So remember, you can use connection in your OIC only when your connection status will be in configure status. So just here, I will save this connection. It's already 100% because it doesn't require any credentials. And now once we save, you just go back. So this we created as a trigger, right? So this one, the rest one, trigger. Where is it? Yeah, this one, three connection, right? So this three connection is in right now draft status. Let me save again. Here you can see it's in draft status, so we have to test. So now once we click on test, so it got tested, and once it tested, it's changed the status to 100%, and now a status of this integration is draft. So just you have to save again. So once you will save your connection status will be changed to configure. So now once your connection will be in configure status, then only you will be able to use your connection in OIC integration. So now our first connection as a trigger done. We will go for another connection, that is invoke type connection, invoke role type connection. So now here we already provided the URL, ID and password. So just we have to click on test to check that everything is fine or not. And now here we will click on save to change the status from draft to configure. Remember, when we are passing the user ID and password here, it's not going to check the user ID password in the system. It's just validating that we are providing the user ID password or not. So it will validate the user ID password runtime when it will invoke this REST API from OIC. So that's why if you will provide invalid one, it will check, but user ID should be correct. So now we done saved again. So connection status is in configure right now. So we'll go back. So let me add the filter here also, FOAS underscore REST. So these two connections having the status as configure. You can see the first two connection. The last one is trigger and invoke. So this is trigger and invoke. Again, here we provided all these things. The configure process is 8% only. So just I have to test. So once we will test, so this will be tested successfully, and then a status will be changed to 100%. And now status is in draft. I will click on save. So once we will save the connection, a status will be changed to configure. And when a status is in configure, it means that connection is ready to use. Just go back. You can see our all this connection, REST connection, all this REST connection is added here, and all these REST connections are in configure status. So now we have to go back to the integration, and again same, if you want to search here. So if I will click here, and if I will search our integration, just providing the same name. So whatever connection having that invoke or trigger and invoke type role, it will display here. You can see the connection FOS having the type as invoke. Okay. So here you can see we have that connection created. So in connection page, we are able to search the connection with this name, right? When we are searching, we are able to see only these three connection. When integration, when we are searching the connection with the same name, we are not able to see, and we are able to see the old connection which we already deleted. So why we are saying able to see here? Just because before creating the connection, we already opened this integration canvas and it's not loaded to the connection page. To check the connection and to load the connection, again we have to go back to the integration. So just discard it. This is our XX01, that schedule integration. So let me edit the integration again. And here you can see, and now if I will search that one, sorry. So now here we will be able to see that connection created. So you can see we are able to see these two connection here out of three. So out of three, we are able to see two connections. The two connection is invoke type connection, trigger and invoke type connection, but trigger connection we are not able to see. So it's quite clear that we are not able to see the trigger role type connection because this is schedule integration, and this schedule integration already having the trigger and point which is schedule. That's why we are not able to see the trigger and point trigger connection here, right? And here we are able to see the trigger and invoke connection. Why? Because this having the invoke capability too. So that's why they given, because the same connection we can use as a trigger, we can use as an invoke too. So now move to that AppDriven integration. Again, we have to go back to load the connection here. So now once you will open this integration again, you will be able to search the connection. So here I will click on this invoke connection, trigger connection type. So here you can see, here we are able to see the connection, and the connection we are able to see, we are able to see the trigger connection, and we are able to see trigger and invoke, but invoke role type connection we are not able to see. So why we are not able to see invoke role type connection? Because this is app-driven integration, and app-driven integration require at least one trigger connection first, so that this can be started and it can process further. So the same way here, this schedule is already the trigger and point. That's why it's able to see the invoke connection. So the same way, when we will add the trigger connection here, then only it will allow you to show the invoke connection. So that's why it's not showing the invoke type connection, which is there, this one. FOS rest underscore INV con. And you should not be confused that what is FOAS. That FOA is the short name of Fox Oracle App Solution. So in your project, so whenever you will work any of the project, each and every project having their own naming convention, they use the same naming convention for creating the connection, creating the lookup, to create the integration, to create the database connectivity, and all these things, right? So that's why we try to follow the same sequence. So here this is our endpoint, right? So I will not use this XX0Z2 name. So I use just the name just for that showing that integration. So I will remove this connection, this sorry, this integration. Also I will remove this schedule integration too, which we already created in our previous session. So because I don't want to use any that name which is not in correct format, so that it will make a wrong impact. So here you can see this is XX01. This is not deleted from here because the page is not loaded. So once you will load the page, it will be removed because we already loaded it, deleted it, right? So yeah. So now let me delete all this tab. Now here we have to create app-driven integration. So I will just click on create. I will select the application, give the name FOAS underscore. I will give the name INT00. I will give the 5. This 5005 is integration code. So in your project, integration code be based on your integration. For example, for creating AP invoices, there will be separate code. For creating the purchase requisition, there will be different code. For creating that the PO receipt, payment, GL load, and all. For each and every integration, will have separate identifier, and that identifier you can use here in while creating your integration, so that it can be easy to identify. So now FOS int005, and what kind of task that integration is going to perform? It's going to display the log message. So I will use that, or just first app integration int. So this is first app-driven integration. I'm just going to give name like that only. And here we already discussed the version and all. So this version we will cover in upcoming session. So I'm not going to pick on that part. So here again, I will select new packages. So earlier we already created one package that foas.sc. Sc means that schedule integration. So I will use foas.ap. So now you can see we are not able to see any package with that AP name, right? So when we will pass AP here, so what it will do, it will create package with this name, that foas.ap. So I will just give the brief description, that is this is our first app driven, that is application integration. Now click on create. So when we create on create, so our integration page is here and we don't have any endpoint. That's why we first created connection, so that connection we can use in our integration to initiate our integration. So for adding the connection in your integration, you have two way. The one way is that just click on the plus icon, select the connection here, or another way, just click on this trigger icon here and you can select the connection here. So which connection we created? We created connection as FOAS underscore REST TRI con. So this TRI con is something that trigger connections. I will use the connection here. So remember, when I will drag this trigger connection here, so our integration will have one trigger and point trigger connection. So this connection you will not be able to find after once we will add the connection here, right? So I will show you that too. Let me add the connection here. Just select the connection, drop here. It's not so. Let's select view. Yeah, sometimes it's getting problems. Okay, let me create by clicking plus icon here. So I will select, this is the same connection, right? FOS REST trigger con. I will select here. So right, giving the naming, good naming convention, it's really too much important. Why? Because if you will see, once I will click here, I'm able to see too many connections available, right? And right, if you will use any invalid name and all that, which is not in correct format, it will be difficult to identify. You can see that add underscore 7, pp underscore 10 trg. You are not able to identify the connection roles, types, and all using that connection, right? So that's why we will provide naming convention in a such way only. So we'll give. So here you can see this is asking the name of the endpoint. So if you remember, when we created schedule endpoint, that schedule endpoint having their own name as schedule. If we added, when we added the logger endpoint, for logger endpoint, we have to provide the name. So same as this is our first endpoint we are going to add here as a trigger. So we have to provide the name to that endpoint. So what I will give name as a start. So this start, it means that this is going to start our integration. Even instead of a start, you can also use trigger. So I'm going to use a start. So always I prefer that a start only. A start, and what kind of endpoint it is? This is REST connection endpoint, right? So that's why I will use a start REST REST. So even you can use a star underscore REST too. So I will just use a start REST. So now this is description about the endpoint. I don't want to provide anything because it's not mandatory and I will not give anything like that. So just click on continue. So this is something that we'll cover later. It's related to that while invoking this integration, we have to pass few values and that values we can configure here. So that we are going to cover later. So continue. So just for brief, I'm going to give you here. So this is something that option, if you will see, this is the REST API. This REST API for creating the invoice, you can see that the 111.13.18.05/invoice, the same API you will find for, this is for post method, the same API you will find for different methods. So just like here is invoice, let me show you that one table somewhere. Update invoice, right? So, or you can see here, delete an invoice. If you will select here, you will be able to see that same API having the URL here, right? So that kind of things you can achieve using by adding the tick here. We will cover this in upcoming session, and you can see the same API, but the method is different. That method there is delete. So if you will go for update, So here you can see the same API but having that method as fetch. So that kind of things we can achieve our integration using this way, right? So that is known as multiple verb for that API, right? So I will just click on continue. So our endpoint is ready, given the name as a start rest. So now once you will go next, so it will ask you that the what this endpoint relative URL is going to do. So for example, I told you this is that URI, this is the relative URI or URI we can say to create or to update the invoices, right? So this is not the complete REST API to update the invoice. To make this complete REST API, so we have to concrete the Fusion URL. So in that way, this Fusion URL we already given in that endpoint. We already given in the REST API, right? While creating the REST connection. So remaining thing, right? This point, this is called as URI of that REST API. So the same way when we are creating connection, creating app-driven integration and selecting the REST as a trigger connection, it means that we are going to create app-driven integration and we are going to expose that app-driven integration as a REST API. So when we are going to expose our integration as a REST API, so what will be the URI for that REST API? That resource URI for that REST API or that endpoint for that REST API. So the same way here, this having that the invoice as a resource URI or the endpoint, it's the same way we can use here. So let me give the endpoint as app driven first integration. So where it will display, I will show you once I will run this integration. Right. So make sure that let me make a note of this endpoint so that you can be validated. So this is the resource URI we given URI endpoint. Right. So now here you can see this is the method they are asking to select. So this method as we are going to create as I use this connection as a trigger. So this method will be for our this integration. So this integration, if any other system will invoke our integration, then what kind of method they will use? Just like for invoking this API, we have to use patch method. So the same way for invoking our integration, what kind of method they will use? They will means the third system you will use. So that we have to select. So obviously there are slight differences between all these methods. So most of the time while creating our integration, we will select post. So when we are saying will select post, so when you will use post, you will get option to configure the request payload or you will get option to configure the response payload. So if you will not select the post here, suppose we are going to use get only. So you can see the request payload is hidden. You cannot add the request payload to this integration. It means that when you will run this integration or any other third party will run your integration, they will not be able to pass any value as a request payload, as get method is just used to retrieve the data. So the same way this integration will only return the data. That's why here we have enabled this option that receive the response. So whoever will call our integration, they will receive the response. So we have option to add the response, but we don't have option to add the request. Why? Because we selected the method as get. So the same way if we will select your method as put, so it will give options. So just like when we are using put, it means that we can pass some value. Based on that value, we can perform some operation. That API can perform some operation and it will return some data. So that's why when we are using put, we are able to see the option as request and response both. So generally we're creating integration. So we are going to create integration in a generic way that they can retrieve the data, they can perform operations and all. So that's why we are just going to select method as post. And obviously, if you want to add the parameters or request payload or response payload, you can make a tick here, else you can skip. So as this is our first integration, I will not select anything. That request and the response will go next. Here one more option we have, that is review parameters. So I will show you that what is this review parameter and how it works in our upcoming integrations, right? So now here you can see we have few more configurations set up, that configure header request, configure response request. So all this we are going to skip. So we will get to know or we will learn all this when we will invoke any REST API to perform transaction from OIC. So at that time, I will explain this point. Now I'm going to skip everything here. Just selected the method as post. I will click on continue. So as we have not selected any of the method to configure payload, configure parameters and all, we are not getting any option further. It's just directly moving to the last page, which is the review page, where we can check our APIs and all, our endpoint details. So you can, once you will expand this endpoint summary, you will be able to see that whatever you said. So I said that endpoint as this one, method as post. Just click on finish. So now once you click on the finish, you can see by default this stop endpoint added. So why this stop endpoint added? This stop endpoint, it means that this integration is not going to return any value, which is correct, right? While adding this endpoint, we have not selected response payload part. So that's why when this integration will be executed, it will not return any values. Right. So this is our trigger endpoint we added. Now, if you will go to the connection again, you can see the connection icon got changed, and this icon is for invoke. You can see, right? Invoke message you are able to see. Once you will click here, now you will not be able to find your trigger connections. If I will search FOAS underscore race, you will not be able to find the trigger connection. So you can see we have option as trigger and invoke or invoke. So this trigger you are able to see here, which is mentioned in use, that this connection is already in use. You cannot use this connection. You can see, right? When we are clicking here, try to drag, we are not able to drag. But if you select this connection, we are able to drag this connection here, right? So that's the connection roles over there. So now here we added. Now same as schedule integration which we worked on. Let me add few log messages. Then in next integration we will add parameters to the log message. So that kind of things we will work. So for adding the log message, again, I will go to the connection, that action. I will select the logger here. So I will drag here this endpoint where we will get the plus icon. So this is the endpoint name, right? So it's able to see that logger one here. So in the integration, if you will see at the time, while adding this one, we added the endpoint name as start rest. That's why we are able to see the start rest here, right? So now I will change the name logger one as a logger underscore message. And I will make it tick to save. And now here we have to display the message we want to display. So I want to display the message as hi. This is our first app driven application integration. Whatever message you will provide in the single quotes starting and ending, that will be considered as a fixed value, and the same value you will be able to use or you will be able to see. This value will not be changed. So for changing the value, we have to use variables and all, right? So we are not going to check that one too. So here this is done. So now I'm just going to click outside so that that value can be fixed here. Now you can see this integration, we added this endpoint, everything is fine, but again we are getting one error here. And you know that the why we are getting this error. So we are getting this error because it's mandatory to have a minimum one business identifier to each and every integration. This integration we created, but we didn't add any business identifier to this integration. So once we have to add, we will add business identifier, error will be resolved. So I will click here. Even for checking the error message or error name, you can click here to check the error message. So again, once you will click here, you will be able to see the same message that business identifier missing. That is primary business identifier is missing. So I will go here and here I will select any, this is the identifier and we have to select the value. So obvious, as this is not schedule parameters, a schedule integration which will have that start date, start time as a variable. So if you will expand here, you will be able to see some values, that some values is like this is the method which we selected as a post. This is the URI which we selected. This is the resource URI, and this is the complete path. So whatever things you will use, you will map here. The same you will be able to see in the integration monitoring dashboard. So let me go and use the method only. So I will drag the method here, and even you can change the identifier name. So by default, it's saying that HTTP request method. So I will change the name here. I will give the name as integration int method. Let me use int underscore method. So just I will click outside so that this variable can be fixed. And once we added that identifier, that error got removed. and our integration is in configure status, but the next stage is unsaved changes. So we have to save the changes. So just save the changes here. So once we click on save and everything is fine, our integration status got changed to configure. And like you may know that whenever our integration is in configure status, we will be able to activate this integration and we can run easily. So again, I will click on this power button and I will select the tracing level. So as I already explained that what is the difference between all this tracing level. So I will just click on debug so that every time we can see the log messages and we'll click on activate. Even we are able to see few parameters here that enable payload validation. This is the new features provided in generation 3 that using this endpoint we can validate the payload which we are going to pass to that integration. But right now we are not using any payloads. We will skip that one. This will allow you to run your integration with the same instance again and again if you want. So I don't want to run this integration again. So I will just click on this activate. So all these things you can do from monitoring dashboard. We'll cover in upcoming session. So now our integration is activated. So it's in process. So just once you will reload, it will be changed the status to activate. Right. So now the same way, like when we are running this any schedule integration, we just have to click on three dot and we are clicking on run. So the same way you have to click on this three dot and you have to click on this run button. So once you will click here, it will open the page where you will run the integration. Now you can see, if you remember, while creating the endpoint, we given this resource URL or URI to the endpoint as AppDriven slash first integration, and same you are able to see here that AppDriven slash first. And this is the same as that standard API available in the market. That is, you can see the invoices right here. Right? So now I told you when we are creating app-driven integration, remember this point. When we are creating app-driven integration and selecting the REST endpoint as a trigger, it means that we are exposing our app-driven integration as a REST API. So here you can see this is the complete URI, the URI for this REST API for our integration. And the same way, then when we added that the REST can is the fusion host here. So the same way we have to add the OIC host here in this before this one, so that it will be considered as a complete REST API. I will show you that how we can execute to in upcoming session. So this is that one which added. And if you remember, while configuring the REST endpoint, we selected the method at post. So that's why you are able to see post here. In our integration, we have not added any request payload, any response payload. That's why you are not able to see in the body anything to pass here. We don't have any parameters to that integration. That's why you are not able to see anything here. We have not configured any headers. We have not configured any integration property. That's why we don't have anything, right? So we just created one simple integration and we have to run that one. Even you can see in the response, you will not able to find anything in the response. So here for running the integration, we just have to click on this run button. So once you will click on the run button, it will start the integration with the help of that trigger endpoint we added. Just like in scheduler integration, we have schedule endpoint. So you can see this integration completed successfully. For checking again, we will for next year we will reload again so that every log message can be available. So now you can see this is the endpoint start risk we added. With the help of this endpoint, our integration got triggered, that triggered by this endpoint. And all these are the mapper. These are all the activity of the log activity of our integration. So once you will click here, you will be able to see all the details to that integration, that URL, the method, the integration name and all. So you can see message started processing. So once you will click on this eye icon, you will able to see the properties of your integration, property of this app-driven integration. So you can see what kind of property is there. The property is method, that method is post. The same method we mapped as a business identifier. Remember, in business identifier, we map the same method. So this post, it will display over there in the monitoring dashboard. I will show you. And you can see this is the URI, and this URI, you can see this is the complete URI. And this URI is something your REST API for this integration. So most of the time, if you remember from VBCS page, we are executing our integration. So from VBCS page, they are executing integration using this REST API only. So it means that this integration will be exposed as a REST API, and this is the URL of that REST API, the complete URL. And for that URL, you can say this is the resource URI we added, this one, and this is the integration sort name, this is the integration version, and these are the flow that this is saying that integration having REST flow, and these are the from API, right? This is our OIC instance URL. So the same way we are adding the Fusion host URI, right? URL. So I will explain this you more when we will check this one while running from any other applications and all. So now you can see the same way we have relative URI, that relative URI, the endpoint we added, the path. So this is the path of that our integration. By making this one, it will make full, and by adding that OIC instance URL. So this is the brief info about the metadata or that the details of this integration. So now we added one logger in our integration. So you can see we given the endpoint name of this logger is logger underscore message. And once you will click on this endpoint, you will be able to see the same message which we pass, that hi, this is our first app driven application integration. So this is the app-driven integration we created. So we added the business identifier too. So for checking that one, what we have to do, we have to navigate to the monitoring dashboard. So this is the one option that you can manually move to the monitoring dashboard. Another option is when you will run the integration, you will be able to see the track instance page, right? So once you will click on this track instance, this integration will be moved directly to the instance monitoring dashboard. And here you can see this is our integration in the monitoring dashboard of instance. And you can see the time taken, like 4 minutes ago, it's taken 99 milliseconds to execute. Status is success. And in our integration, we added only one business identifier. That's the primary identifier. That's why the primary identifier we are able to see. And we given the identifier name as int underscore method. So this is the business identifier name, int method. And what value we map? We map the value as a integration method, that is post. In this integration, we will have only one identifier. That's why the remaining business identifier we are not able to see here. And again, if you want to see the log message of this instance, here in the last, you can see the I icon. Once you will click on this I icon, same activity string you are able to see here. And this is the instance, that instance ID for this integration. So earlier in generation 3, it was numeric, and in generation 3, it's alphanumeric. So that's all about that app-driven integration. So in next session, we will create one app-driven integration where the same way while creating in schedule integration, we pass two values to add the sum of the two number. So in app-driven also, we will pass two values, and we'll check that how we can pass the value while running the app-driven integration. So that's we are going to cover in upcoming session. So we are already done with creating the app-driven integration. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining and be there in the session. And yes, if you have any other queries and you want to ask, platform is open for you. You can ask your